First, I want to say that my talk will not be inspiring like the one we just heard. The sacrifice of that war was so graphically demonstrated by that story of those simple guys who went off to a war in a country where they weren't even born. It's a wonderful story. It was very nice. Secondly, I came here prepared to talk about 1859, which was the year before Lincoln got elected. And there were, counting Lincoln, there were 10 candidates for president in the Republican Party. Harper's Weekly, the Sunday before the convention, had a picture in the middle. It was an enlarged picture, like the sun, of William Seward, the favorite, and the other, all the also-rans, including Lincoln, were around in a circle, like the planets around the sun. That's in my book, which look at Lincoln's Ladder to the Presidency, and it graphically demonstrates the situation then. The reason I was going to talk about this year is this year we have 11 candidates for president. The leader could be in the middle in the sun, and all the guys could all be around in a circle. The only difference is one of the guys, the sun himself, has been indicted. So things are different for darn sure. So rather than go there, I decided to talk. Last night we all had dinner together, and the talk was about artifacts and the programs that were going to be given. And that reminded me of a letter that I'd like to talk about, which is more specifically relevant to the program. And by the way, this letter, the name of my talk was The Most Interesting Lincoln Document I've Ever Read. And I'll explain that quote. And the letter was a subject of an article in the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. So I give a plug to Jayla. And just by coincidence, Mary has a stack of them out there that happens to be the issue that had my article in it. So you don't have to take notes, just go grab one of those. And the letter is really important in telling where Lincoln was in 1854. Just by way of background, you'll recall Lincoln was a Whig, and the Whig Party was falling apart. The Republican Party hadn't quite been formed yet. It might have been formed. There's a claim in Ripon in Wisconsin, and there's a claim in Michigan, Jackson, Michigan. Somewhere the party was formed, but it was not formed in Illinois. But in 1854, Lincoln received a letter. Lincoln had gotten himself elected to the legislature. And if you remember, before whatever amendment that was in 1913, when Senate races became decided by popular vote, the legislature voted for the senators. And Lincoln was in the legislature and got a letter from Elijah Powell, a lawyer in Peoria, who was a Whig also. Got a letter advising him that he could not vote. Since he was in the legislature, he'd have to be voting for the senatorial candidate. That election would occur after when the legislature convened in January of 59. Excuse me, 56. And Lincoln would not be eligible to run for the Senate because he was in the legislature. And that letter is in the Library of Congress, I'm happy to say. And to show you the completeness of that collection, that letter was in the Robert Todd Lincoln papers that were acquired. You remember, that's a great story. Robert Todd Lincoln left them to the Library of Congress not to be opened until 25 years after his death, which was somewhere in the late 40s. My parents, this is how strange I was as a kid. I was 12. My parents, for Christmas in 1950, gave me the 2-volume set of selections from the Lincoln papers, which included that letter from Powell to Lincoln. And in the letter, Powell said, apparently you don't know that you are ineligible to run for the Senate if you vote for yourself as a legislator. And Lincoln wrote him back, and that's the letter I want to talk about. And it's interesting in a couple of respects. And I have to, believe it or not, I need readers. And if you want to know how old I am, I'm older than Burlingame. I also dropped my cane. Thanks, man. When Lincoln in this letter, and I love this letter because he's being a little coy about it. He says, "Acting on your advice and my own judgment, I have resigned from the legislature." Now, I think what he was saying, he couldn't admit that he didn't know it. But so that makes this interesting. So, but in that letter, so the letter is really two-pronged. That's the most important one. That Lincoln was going to run for the Senate in 55. Pardon me. Running for the Senate means going to the legislative session, and the campaigning in those days was for the legislators and how they voted. We're going to vote, which is what the Lincoln-Douglas campaign was all about too. But in this case, Lincoln he resigned and headed off to hopefully become the next senator. And if you think of the implications of that, had Lincoln been in the United States Senate then, when 1860 rolled around, he probably would have been ineligible or not a viable candidate for President of the United States. So the race was on, and you remember that the anti-slavery forces were twofold. There were the Whigs, anti-slavery Whigs. The Whigs party was still barely breathing, but it was still alive. And there were the anti-slavery Democrats. So, and the two groups had been obviously at each other's necks, at throats for years. So here they are now by virtue of the anti-slavery movement provoked primarily by Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act, opening the whole country up, the new territories, to slavery. Provoked by that, the two parties were coming together, the ex-Democrats and the ex-Whigs, but that wasn't necessarily a friendly match. They had a lot of things to get over with, but Lincoln had worked hard, and by the time it came time to vote, this was for the legislature to vote, he needed 50 votes to be elected to the Senate, combined votes from the Senate and the House of Representatives, and he had 45. So it looked like a pretty good bet that he would win the Senate. He only needed 5 more. It took 9 ballots, and Lincoln held for 1 or 2, but after he didn't get any, he never picked up a 46th, so his lead started to slip away, and that opened the door for I've got his name. Lyman Trumbull, thanks, of Alton, by the way. I've been by his house, but I forgot his name. So, but of Trumbull, the ex-Democrat. And Lincoln, when he saw the handwriting on the wall, typical of him, a smart politician, the problem was there were other candidates for that Senate seat who were soft on slavery. And Lincoln knew it had to be Trumbull. It had to be Trumbull in order to keep the anti-slavery vote in the Senate. And so he backed out, and that led to Trumbull's victory by him getting out of the way. So that tells us a lot about Lincoln. Number one, it shows us he was a smart politician. Number two, he wasn't doctrinaire. He didn't resent the fact that this guy had been a Democrat, like many Republicans of these soon-to-be Republicans did, and he was willing to back down and take the long view. By way of comparison, Trumbull's wife, Julia, was the maid of honor in Mary Lincoln and Abe's wedding. Mary never spoke again to Julia Trumbull because of the fact that Abe had lost So that tells us, those comparisons tell us something about both of those people. So now he's out of the race for the Senate. So now he can put on his run for the White House, and that was anonymous. I mean, he didn't announce that he was going to run for president, but he started making serious moves that got him there. In 1856, the Republican Party, which had not yet been formed in Illinois, in May of '56, the Republican Party had a convention in Bloomington, Illinois, half a block from where my office used to be, in a building, of course, with the historical values of our city. They tore the building down where Lincoln made his lost speech. It was in that building, the Republicans were formed then, that convention. And Lincoln made the keynote address. And I consider it to be, let me say first, it's the lost speech, because the legend is Lincoln was so eloquent and so moving that the reporters were stunned and just dropped their pens and listened in awe. Well, newspaper men had to be better than that, and Lincoln had to be better than that. Lincoln relied on the press like no lawyer I've ever seen. You remember after the Cooper Union speech, he went over to the Herald and reviewed their version of his speech and corrected it so it'd be right in the newspapers in New York. So in this case, in any event, there was no record of what he said. So it's a guess what he said, but we know from his other speeches what he would have been saying. And this is old news to you, but just to review it, we all know Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was a moderate Republican. The moderate Republicans saw that the end of slavery would come if it was not expanded. Stephen A. Douglas, with his Kansas-Nebraska Act, opened up the possibility of every territory now got to choose whether it was going to be anti-slavery or not. So the assumption that the Lincolns of the party and of the country had was that this thing would never expand. It'll die a slow death, and in a couple of generations, it'll be over without any real trauma, which of course turned out to be true because we didn't get rid of slavery, and the trauma was astounding, which we've just heard about. So that was the price that was paid. But Lincoln, in making that speech, I think, this is my theory, because nobody knows why it's not recorded. But my guess is, as cagey as he was, and as relatively radical, he wasn't a radical, he was a moderate, but compared to the general population, and racism in Illinois in those days, and maybe continuing, racism in Illinois, we cannot be proud of our history when it comes to racism in this state. But the fact is, Lincoln went to that convention, gave a speech that was as gripping as they say, and took command of the Republican Party that day when it was formed. He became the leader of the party in Majors Hall in Bloomington, Illinois on May 29th, 1856. But we don't know what he said because I think he didn't want that to be known. I think if the word got out that he was even giving his views and have that view, and that was eventually what the Republican Party in Illinois adapted, was that view. If that got out, that the Republican Party might die because it was so extreme for so many people in Illinois. So my thought is it didn't get lost because the reporters just dropped their pens. It got lost because Lincoln was preaching to the choir, and he didn't want it to get out to the congregation, in effect. So that was in '56. We all know about '58 and so forth. And when he went against Douglas again. But back to the letter, the other thing that makes this letter so fascinating is this. He said, after saying, rejecting Powell's advice, or thanking him for the advice, but saying, yeah, I kind of knew that too, which I still am amused by that. But then the next thing he said, quote, "Things are going reasonably well, but I'm afraid I will be asked to stand upon a platform I cannot support." Now, that's ambiguous. That could be, at this time, he had not gone over yet. This was this letter was written in November of 54. So at that point, he had not yet become a Republican. So did that mean that he was going to be asked to accept the platform of the that said we should sanction slavery and let it go where it goes, or did that mean that he would be asked to support the platform of the Republican Party to control the spread of slavery? I'd like to think it was the latter, but that's why the letter never got out. He did not want people to know the content of his speech. And he and Powell remained friends. They had been lawyers together. And as you know, my field is really Lincoln's law practice. And Powell was a Peoria lawyer. The Peoria wasn't part of the circuit, but they had a lot of cases together and were good friends. So that was the background that they had. And this, as they worked together, they coordinated their efforts to the great benefit of our country. The ultimate path that Lincoln took, as you know, was in 59, the year I was going to talk about. He went to he started campaigning. He declined after he lost to Douglas. Jesse Fell from Bloomington, who was the publisher of the newspaper and very influential and probably the most liberal of Lincoln's friends, Fell went to him and wanted him to write an autobiography. And Lincoln said, no, there's no point in me doing that because it wouldn't be of any use. Because he'd written 2 letters to supporters saying that he was through. He'd done his job. He was loyal to the cause. He would stay loyal to the cause, but he would never serve the cause as a candidate. Then in January of 5th of 59, the legislature met and they voted Douglas into the legislature as expected. And all these guys got together, all these Republicans, friends of his, and the Central Committee got together on the 6th of January. Where do we go now? And Lincoln having announced, of course, that he wasn't going to be a candidate anymore. And so they sat around talking about who they would back for president in 1860, the following year. And Lincoln sat there and sat there and sat there. Nobody mentioned his name. So finally, according to a quote of David Davis, the judge who was his major political manager, Lincoln said, well, what about me? And they all looked surprised. He said, I can be nominated, I can be elected, and I can run the government. So that ended that talk about who we're going to pick. They reached no decision. And Lincoln, thus emboldened, went out and spent the year becoming a candidate without appearing to be a candidate. He spoke widely in Illinois the first 6 months. Then he went to Council Bluffs, Iowa, on business. All this was under the cover of not being he didn't want to be known as a candidate. So he went then to in Ohio, had made many speeches, went into Wisconsin and made some speeches. His trip to Wisconsin was to greet an agricultural fair, or to talk to an agricultural fair about the impact of agriculture on the country, and that was, of course, part of the cover. And then from there, he went and gave some political speeches, and then he gave one in Indianapolis, and he spoke in Illinois twice, and then finally, in December of 1859, having tested the waters, as I call it, he sent a letter to Fell saying, enclosed is the autobiography you requested of me last year. As you can see, there's not much to it because there's not much of me, which is vintage Lincoln. And then from that time on, he was off to the races running for the presidency, which he got the nomination in 1860, of course, and then was elected president. And today we are not 2 countries, because of he won the election and became the 16th president of the United States. Thank you. Yeah. Any questions? What?
I got one.
Yeah.
What was there something in the Illinois state constitution that would have prevented Lincoln from being a candidate?
Yes. Yeah. It was not permitted for the legislators to run. They had to resign if they wanted to be run for the Senate.
Yeah, well, I understand that was the gist of the letter, but
right.
I assumed it must have been in the state constitution.
It was. Yes, it was. And so, yes, sir.
Lincoln's disavowal of national ambitions strikes me as a little interesting, since in 1856 he almost got the Republican nomination for vice president. Is there some? Well,
he had no interest in that, of course, but he was now on the map. That's right, in '56.
Did he allow his name to be bandied about for the vice presidency?
No, he made it very clear in this meeting I talked about when they were all getting together that when he said this, I can run and I can be elected. So he made it clear to them he was not interested in the vice presidency.
But was he in 1856?
No, he never was. He never was. And 56 was he was. You're right. He was talked about as a candidate. But 56 is so important, and of course I'm from Bloomington, so you might want to take it from a grain of salt. But the 56 speech established him as the leader of the Republican Party in the state of Illinois, and the Republican Party in the state of Illinois at that time was one of the most important, and Illinois is one of the most important states in the country because they had not. Fremont didn't carry Illinois, so they had to have Illinois, and so that was very important that he was positioned. He was always positioning himself without positioning himself, without admitting it. And I compare that with today, when there are so many people we wish weren't running. I don't want to mention any names.
All of the above.
Yeah. Thank you very much.